The sun rose over Sedona like a sheet of molten copper being poured across the sky, spilling down the jagged red cliffs and flooding the valley with light so sharp it felt like a blade, and Lila Sharif stood at the edge of it, her bare feet sinking into the cool grit of the rock, breathing in air that smelled of juniper, sage, and the faint ghost of wood smoke drifting up from some unseen fire far below. She had dreamed of this view once, when she was still a girl, restoring broken amphora in the back rooms of the Smithsonian, thinking of deserts she might never see. But now the sight pressed down on her like a weight she could not lift, a world of beauty she could touch but not claim. And the diamond ring on her finger, heavy, flawless, set high enough to catch every flare of the new day, burned against her skin like a brand more than a jewel, catching the sunlight and throwing it back in a cruel flash as if mocking her, as if whispering, "You are owned, you are seen, you are caught." The resort behind her was silent, its adobe walls glowing pink in the dawn, the kind of luxury retreat where the air is curated like perfume, and every stone in the path has been chosen to match a designer's mood board. But for her, it had become a prison whose walls shifted from Manhattan to Malibu to Sedona, yet never opened. She clutched the railing carved into the rock, fingers trembling, and thought of the long nights she had spent mapping the canyons in her mind, memorizing the shapes of the ridges, the direction of the dry creek beds, the hours when the staff changed shift and the guards' patterns thinned, and she had waited for this one chance, this one sliver of darkness to slip through. The night before, when Kalen had been on a call in the main lounge, his voice smooth but edged, talking about some acquisition she pretended not to hear, she had moved like a ghost through the suite, sing in dark cotton instead of silk, tucking her hair under a scarf to break her silhouette, pressing her heartbeat down until it felt like part of the floor, carrying nothing but a folded wad of bills she'd hidden inside a paint tube, a prepaid SIM card wedged between pages of an art catalog, her entire escape crammed into things meant to hold color and stories. She'd stepped out through the glass door into the breathless chill of the desert night and started down the trail she had memorized, every crunch of gravel under her shoes louder than a gunshot in her ears, the moonlight painting the cliffs in silver and shadow, the smell of dust and pine like a secret she might still belong to. She'd gone 50 yards that felt like a lifetime, before the air shifted and a voice behind her said quietly, "Coyotes come out after midnight, Mrs. Marcus." And she turned and saw Jin standing just beyond the shadow of a boulder, his expression unreadable, his suit jacket buttoned though the night was cold. A figure carved from discipline and silence, the man who was always there but never spoke unless Kalen's will moved through him. And now he stepped closer, not grabbing her, not threatening, just existing like a wall of stone she could not pass, his eyes steady but not cruel. The desert wind moving the edge of his tie as he gestured back toward the resort. She wanted to scream at him, to run anyway, but her legs had gone weak and the sky above felt too large, the stars like eyes, and she knew she had lost. Without a word, she let him guide her back up the path, the rocks cold and uneven under her shoes, her pulse hammering in her throat as the adobe walls reappeared between the cacti and the low lights of the terrace flickered like watchful insects. Inside, the scent of sandalwood and expensive whiskey wrapped around her like another chain, and Kalen was waiting, not pacing, not shouting, just standing near the window in a charcoal sweater, his profile against the rising sun, a study in restraint, his fury an iceberg instead of a flame, and when he turned his eyes, on her it was like being struck by the same light that had burned the cliffs outside, too bright to hold. "You'd rather die out there," he said softly. Not a question, his voice smooth as marble but edged with something sharp. "Then stay in paradise with me?" She could not answer, her throat too dry, her body still trembling with the nearness of escape, and the silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, humming with everything she could not say, everything he already knew, until even the desert beyond the glass seemed to be holding its breath. And in that breathless moment she realized that in this world of red rock and gold rings, and men who spoke in soft threats, her silence was the only answer she had left. The silence that followed her answerless stare lingered even after Kaylin turned away, and that silence carried her back in time like a slow current, pulling her toward the life she had before. His name filled her lungs. A year earlier, long before Sedona's red cliffs and guarded suites, Lila Sharif had lived in a different kind of quiet, one filled with the hum of restoration lamps and the soft, rhythmic scrape of her brush lifting centuries of dust from broken relics in the Smithsonian's lab. The air there always smelled faintly of paper and varnish, of old paint and coffee gone cold, and she had loved that smell more than perfume because it was honest, unpretentious, the scent of history being coaxed back to life. She would spend hours bent over a fragment of clay, her brown fingers steady, her eyes tracing the faint ridges of a pot that had once held someone's daily bread thousands of years ago. And in those moments, she felt closest to purpose, not fame or money, just the quiet reverence of giving form back to something lost. The world outside the museum had been small, but kind. Rainy commutes on the metro, dinners with her father when he was well, enough to cook, nights spent reading by the kitchen window as the city hummed below. But that world began to fray when the medical bills came. They arrived like an unending tide, pale envelopes stacked on the counter, each one heavier than the last, until she found herself calculating how many extra shifts she could take before exhaustion made her careless with a brush that could never be replaced. Then one evening, a charity gala invited her department to showcase a few restored pieces, and she went reluctantly, wearing a simple black dress she'd worn to a dozen university receptions before, expecting to be invisible as usual. But that was the night she met Kaylin Marcus. He didn't look like a billionaire that evening. No bodyguards, no gold watch screaming for attention. Just a tall man with a quiet confidence, his tuxedo perfectly cut, his smile patient and deliberate. He stood before a reconstructed Greek amphora she had restored, asking questions that startled her with their precision, questions about kiln temperatures, about the chemistry of ancient glazes, the kind of questions no casual donor ever asked. When she told him she was the restorer, not the curator, he had smiled, slow and interested, and said, "Then you're the real artist here." It was a simple sentence, but it cracked something open in her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt in months, maybe years. He asked about her work, about her family, about her dreams, listening the way people rarely did, really listening. And when she mentioned her father's health, he tilted his head, eyes soft with what she thought was compassion. Within a week, there were flowers at her lab, a rare book on Near Eastern pottery left anonymously on her desk, and a handwritten note that said, "For the woman who restores what the world forgets." She had laughed at first, embarrassed, but every gesture was subtle, respectful, thoughtful. When he invited her to lunch at a quiet restaurant tucked behind the National Gallery, she went, telling herself it was for networking. He spoke of his foundation, of his mission to preserve art, beyond the walls of institutions, his belief that museums kept beauty caged when it should be alive in the world. His ideas were intoxicating, visionary, and she found herself wanting to believe him. Days later, when her father's condition worsened and the hospital demanded payment she didn't have, Kaylin called. His voice was gentle, firm, calm. "Let me help," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She resisted, but he was insistent, assuring her it was not charity. It was gratitude for her work. By the next morning, the debt was gone, the hospital bill cleared, her father's room upgraded. Gratitude turned into dependency before she could stop it, and dependency turned into trust. He began visiting her at the museum, not often, just enough to make her heart stumble every time he appeared in the glass reflection behind her. She told herself it was harmless, that she was too sensible to be swept away by a man like him. When he offered her a position in his private collection in Manhattan, a chance to oversee priceless relics, to build a gallery dedicated to preservation rather than profit, she hesitated only a moment. The offer letter shimmered with legitimacy, embossed in gold, the salary impossible to refuse, the promise of creative control irresistible. Her colleagues congratulated her. Her father called her his miracle girl. Within weeks, she was on a private jet for the first time, staring out at the clouds with a mixture of awe and unease. Kaylin across the aisle reading a newspaper as if this flight were just another Tuesday. New York had greeted her with glitter and noise, her new apartment a suite overlooking the skyline, furnished in white and glass. The first time he placed a diamond necklace around her neck at a dinner party, she told herself it was gratitude, not ownership. The first time he introduced her as my curator, she didn't correct him. The first time he called her Lila, darling, she let herself blush instead of question it. It all blurred. The invitations, the champagne, the contracts she signed without reading because they came with smiles and trust. When he asked her to marry him, there was no dramatic proposal, just his hand resting over hers on the balcony of a penthouse, his voice steady as he said, "I can give you everything you've ever restored, and more." She had said yes without realizing the ground beneath her was already closing, that every promise came with a clause, every gift with a key she did not hold. The doors had not slammed shut, they had closed softly, elegantly, like the click of museum glass over an exhibit that would never move again. The city was asleep, but the Brooklyn docks never truly rested. Cranes groaned, waves slapped against steel hulls, and the smell of salt and diesel drifted through the fog like a ghost that refused to leave. Lila sat beside Kaylin in the back of a black Maybach, her reflection a pale ghost in the tinted glass. She didn't ask where they were going. By now she knew better than to ask questions. His silence was the kind that filled the air like smoke, slow and suffocating. When the car stopped near an old warehouse with broken windows and a single dim light flickering over the entrance, Kaylin simply said, "Come with me." The words were not an invitation, they were an order, wrapped in velvet. The night air bit at her skin as she followed him inside, the rhythmic sound of her heels echoing over the cracked concrete. Inside, shadows pooled in the corners. The air smelled of metal, oil, and something old, something ancient. Wooden crates marked with foreign symbols lined the walls, and under the harsh fluorescence stood a man bound to a chair, his face bruised and slick with sweat. Two of Kaylin's men flanked him, their expressions carved from stones. Lila's breath caught when she saw the object on a nearby table, an Assyrian clay tablet, fragments of writing still visible through centuries of wear. Her heart leapt. She knew this piece had once seen it in a digital archive, its disappearance whispered about in the museum world. Kaylin moved toward it with the grace of a curator and the menace of a predator. "Do you know what this is, Lila?" he asked softly, tracing the carved symbols with reverent fingers. "It's the story of a king who thought he could cheat the gods. He tried to rewrite fate, but history always finds the truth." Then he turned his gaze toward the man trembling in the chair. "And you tried to cheat me." His tone never rose, yet it carried enough cold power to make Lila's blood run still. The man mumbled apologies through swollen lips, his voice breaking, but Kaylin didn't seem to hear. He nodded to one of his men, who opened a leather case laid neatly beside the table. Inside gleamed tools meant for restoration, not torture. Kaylin picked up a sculptor's chisel as if it were an extension of his hand. "In my world," he said, turning it slowly between his fingers, "authenticity is everything." Lila wanted to look away, but her body refused to move. The scream that followed tore through the silence, through the warehouse, through her. It didn't sound human, it sounded like a soul being ripped in half. Kaylin wiped the chisel on a linen cloth, meticulous as ever, then turned to her, his expression serene. Now he'll remember the value of truth. He walked past her as though nothing had happened, his cologne mixing with the metallic tang of fear. Outside, the night air hit her lungs like a slap. The Maybach door opened, Jin waiting with that same unreadable calm, and they slid into the silence of the car once again. Lila pressed her palms together, fighting the tremor that refused to leave her hands. Kaylin stared out the window, watching the water ripple beneath the dock lights. "You're a monster," she whispered, the words falling before she could stop them. He didn't turn his head, didn't even flaw an inch. "No, my dear," he murmured, almost kindly. I'm a man who finishes what others begin. The car rolled forward, the city lights reflecting like fire in the black water. Lila looked out into the night and realized the truth. This was not a world built on art or beauty or passion. It was built on ownership, on fear, on control. And she was now a part of it, a living piece in Kaylin Marcus's private collection. The Manhattan skyline shimmered beneath the glass walls of Kaylin's penthouse, the city pulsing below like a living organism, ruthless, restless, alive. From this height, Central Park looked small and tame, a patch of dark velvet stitched into the glittering expanse of steel and glass. Lila stood barefoot on the cold marble floor, her reflection stretching across the polished surface as dawn light began to bleed into the room. Around her, the gallery seemed to breathe, a cathedral of stolen history. Bronze masks from Benin glinted beside marble busts looted from Roman ruins, and every surface told a story that had been ripped from the earth and silenced. To anyone else, it was a paradise of art. To her, it was a mausoleum, a place where beauty came to die behind bulletproof glass. She moved quietly, notebook in hand, her fingers tracing the edges of ancient pottery, cataloging each artifact not as Kaylin's possession, but as someone else's loss. Each entry she made felt like a small rebellion, a whisper against the empire that held her captive. The soft scratch of her pen filled the air like a heartbeat, rhythmic, steady, alive. She'd learned to work in silence, to hide her defiance in plain sight. Kaylin thought she was merely indulging her old profession, restoring and classifying for pleasure. He didn't know that every piece she touched was being traced back to its origin. In the margins of her notes, she scribbled museum names, missing inventory numbers, SMU, giggling rotes she'd recognized from whispers in the museum world. The evidence was building, a slow, invisible storm. She didn't yet know how or when she'd use it, only that she had to. It was the only way she could breathe. As the sun climbed higher, its golden light cut through the glass and fell across the room, catching Kaylin's reflection in the mirror behind her. He'd been standing there, watching. His tailored suit caught the light like armor, his eyes unreadable. "You're awake early," he said, voice low, almost indulgent. Lila didn't turn. "So are you," she answered, her tone even. "Couldn't sleep." Kaylin stepped closer, his shoes silent on the marble, the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the dust of antiquity. "You treat broken things," he said softly, watching her brush dust from a fractured amphora, "as if they can still be loved." Her hands stilled for a moment, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. Then she looked up, meeting his gaze in the reflection. "Everything can," she said quietly, "if someone stops breaking it." The air between them shifted, fragile and dangerous. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, caught somewhere between admiration and something darker. "You think I break things?" he asked, his tone almost curious, as if the idea genuinely intrigued him. Lila turned then, facing him fully, her notebook clutched to her chest like a shield. "You don't just break them," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "You claim them. You decide what's worth saving, and what isn't." Kaylin smiled faintly, but his eyes betrayed no amusement. "And you," he murmured, taking a slow step closer. "Think you're different?" "I don't think," she replied softly. "I remember." The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Kaylin's gaze flickered to the shelves behind her, the artifacts, the history, the ghosts that surrounded them. He reached out, almost absently, and touched the edge of a clay figurine she had been cataloging earlier. "You see cages," he said. "I see preservation, and that's why you'll never understand art," she replied, her tone sharp now, cutting through the heavy quiet. "Art isn't about possession, it's about connection. It's meant to be shared, not owned." Kaylin's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he walked past her, toward the massive windows overlooking the park, hands clasped behind his back. The city below reflected in the glass, a world he ruled from above. "You make it sound simple," he he said finally, as if beauty doesn't need protection, as if the world deserves it. The world deserves truth, she whispered. He turned his head slightly, his profile etched in the pale morning light. For the first time, she saw something flicker across his face. Not anger, not arrogance, but something closer to regret. Truth, he repeated, almost to himself. A dangerous currency. Lila closed her notebook, her heartbeat steadying. She knew she had to be careful now. Kalen Marcus was many things, but stupid was not one of them. He suspected. Maybe not the details, but he sensed the shift in her, the quiet rebellion stirring beneath her calm. And yet, part of him seemed drawn to it. That was the strangest thing of all, the way his eyes softened when she stood her ground, as if defiance itself was an art he admired. He turned toward her then, a faint, unreadable smile tugging at his lips. "You may continue your work," he said, "but I want to see your notes, every evening." She nodded, masking her dread with a calm, professional expression. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Transparency builds trust." His gaze lingered on her for a beat too long. "I've found trust," he said, "is the rarest artifact of all." When he finally left the gallery, the echo of his footsteps faded into the hush of the room. Lila exhaled slowly, her hands trembling only when she was sure he was gone. She turned back to the artifacts, the light shift, ting across their surfaces like ripples of memory. Around her, the relics stood silent, but she could feel their stories humming beneath the dust, the weight of centuries whispering to be free. And in that moment, surrounded by stolen beauty, Lila made a quiet vow. She would not be another artifact locked behind Kalen's glass. She would find a way to return every piece to the world it belonged to, no matter how long it took, no matter what it cost. The cage might glitter like gold, but she was already reaching for the key. The sound of the ocean was different in Malibu. It wasn't gentle. It was alive, crashing against the cliffs like it wanted to break through the walls of Kalen's fortress. The air carried salt and jasmine, the kind of scent that should have felt like freedom. But to Lila, it still tasted faintly of control. The glass doors of the coastal mansion opened wide to the Pacific, revealing a world bathed in silver light. She stood there for a long moment, barefoot on cool stone, the hem of her linen dress stirring in the breeze. It should have felt like paradise, but paradise always came with locks when Kalen Marcus was involved. He had called it a retreat, a place for them to breathe again. Yet the moment the jet had landed, Jin's presence in the background and Silas's shadow near the gate reminded her that peace here was just another illusion. Dinner was served outside on a terrace that overlooked the endless dark sea. 1,000 candles flickered in glass bowls around them, their flames swaying with the ocean wind. The sound of the waves drowned out the noise of the city, leaving only the rhythm of two people sitting across from each other, bound by silence thicker than any chain. Kalen poured her wine himself, a rare gesture that caught her off guard. He wasn't the cold marble statue she was used to tonight. His sleeves were rolled, the top button undone, and for once his eyes weren't calculating. They were searching. "This place," he said, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it, "used to belong to my father." Lila's fork stilled mid-air. She didn't reply, just waited. Kalen leaned back, gazing toward the horizon where the ocean met the dark sky. He built this estate as proof of power, every inch of it, every deal, every person. He believed ownership was the only kind of love that mattered. His tone was detached, but beneath it pulsed something raw, something real. "He told me once, if you don't own it, it will leave you." Lila watched his profile, the faint lines near his eyes, the tension in his jaw that never seemed to ease. She could almost picture him as a boy, standing in the shadow of that kind of man, learning that affection was a transaction, that control meant safety. It didn't excuse him, but it explained something, a fracture behind the steel. "And you believed him," she said softly. Kalen's eyes flicked toward her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I built everything I have to prove him wrong," he said. "And yet, here I am, doing exactly what he did." His gaze met hers then, steady and unguarded. the mask slipping for just a heartbeat. You think I don't know what you see when you look at me, but I do. Her breath caught, because for a moment he wasn't the monster from the warehouse or the man who kept her gilded cage locked. He was human, flawed, bruised, and quietly desperate to be something more. Then why not stop? She asked, the words trembling out before she could think. You have everything. Why keep chasing control when you could have peace? Kalen studied her, the corners of his mouth tightening, as though peace were a language he had never learned. Because peace, he said finally, requires trust, and I don't know what that feels like. The wind picked up, teasing her hair across her face, and when he reached out, hesitant, almost gentle, to tuck a strand behind her ear, something in her chest twisted painfully. For a second, the world went still, the crash of the waves faded, the candles seemed to dim, and the only thing that existed was the space between them, fragile, electric, waiting to break. His hand lingered close enough that she could feel the heat of his skin, and her breath hitched. But then, as if burned by his own desire, Kalen pulled back, retreating into himself with the same precision he used to dismantle a deal. The air cooled instantly. Lila looked away, her eyes glistening in the candlelight, and for the first time since she'd met him, she didn't know whether she pitied him or feared him more. The silence between them deepened, heavy and unresolved. She turned her gaze toward the sea, its endless black waves reflecting the moonlight like shards of glass. And then the moment shattered. The heavy doors to the terrace swung open, and Silas stepped out, his expression carved in tension. He didn't knock, didn't hesitate. We've got a problem, he said, voice low but urgent. Someone's moving on your shipping lanes. Kalen's entire posture shifted. One breath and the softness vanished. The man who had almost reached for her was gone, replaced by the ruthless strategist she knew too well. He set his glass down slowly, a calmness more dangerous than rage settling over him. Who? Unknown, Silas replied. But whoever they are, they've hit 2 freights. They're not amateurs. Kalen rose, the chair scraping softly against the stone. His gaze swept over the horizon once more, then turned to her. The warmth in his eyes had turned to steel. Dinner's over, he said, though his voice carried no anger, just inevitability. As he walked past her, his hand brushed her shoulder. Not possessive this time, not cruel, just a silent acknowledgement that the brief peace they had shared was already gone. Lila stayed seated, her heart pounding, the ocean roaring below like it was trying to warn her. And when the terrace doors closed behind him, she realized that the empire she'd begun to understand was trembling at its foundation. But what terrified her most wasn't the sound of the sea or the danger closing in. It was muck she had wanted, just for a heartbeat, for that touch to stay. The elevator descended with a slow, mechanical hum, the kind that made Lila's stomach knot tighter with every passing second. The glass walls reflected her pale face, Kalen's rigid frame beside her, and the dark gleam of the city lights falling away as they went deeper beneath Manhattan. When the doors finally slid open, the air changed. It was colder here, sterile, humming with electricity. Beneath Marcus Tower, the Empire had a heart, and it beat through wires, servers, and screens. The command rooms stretched wide before them, a cocoon of glass and steel, lined with monitors that painted the space in shifting shades of blue and white. Men moved quietly behind consoles, their expressions detached, their eyes fixed on live feeds from the docks. Kalen walked to the center like a conductor before an orchestra, his movements smooth, his presence filling the room without a word. On the largest screen, a night vision camera showed the waterfront, men in black, crates stacked like shadows, guns glinting in the rain. The sound was muted, but Lila could almost hear it anyway. The low shouts, the heavy breathing, the thud of boots against wet pavement. She stood behind him, her pulse thudding in her throat as she realized what she was watching wasn't strategy. It was war. Kalen's voice broke the silence, calm, precise. Now. One word, and on the screen, chaos unfolded with military precision. His men swarmed from the shadows, the rival crew scattering like startled birds. There was no hesitation, no mercy. Muzzle flashes lit the screen in staccato bursts of white. She flinched with every flash, every silent scream, every body that fell into the water like discarded debris. Around her, no one moved. The room remained still, efficient, alive only through Kalen's control. It was violence reduced to data, life, and death measured by coordinates and commands. When it was over, the screen flickered back to the quiet of the docks, the water now rippling with things she didn't want to name. Lila's voice trembled as it slipped past her lips. You watch people bleed and call it business. Her words hung in the air, soft but sharp, cutting through the low hum of machines. Kalen turned toward her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, there was something behind them, something exhausted, worn. Because you see it as blood, he said quietly. I see it as order. He didn't say it like a defense, but like a confession, one he'd repeated to himself for so long it had become scripture. For a moment, she wanted to argue, to scream that there was no order in destruction, no art in cruelty. But she didn't. The room was full of watchers, and Kalen's world was not one where emotion could survive under fluorescent light. She looked away, her hands curling at her sides, nails biting into her palms just to remind herself she was still real. He turned back to the screens, the glow washing over his face, making him look less like a man and more like something forged out of the very machinery he commanded. When the others finally cleared the room, silence swallowed everything. The hum of the servers filled the space where voices had been. Kalen stood alone now, one hand braced against the edge of the console. His reflection wavered on the black glass of the monitors, a ghost surrounded by the empire he'd built. His fingers trembled, barely, but enough for her to see it. It was strange, that small human fracture in him. It made him look less invincible, more undone. She took a step closer, the click of her heels echoing softly. He didn't move, didn't look up. You think I wanted this? He said, voice low, frayed at the edges. You think I ever wanted to build a world that only survives through control? He finally turned to face her, eyes shadowed, jaw tight. Every man I trusted tried to take what was mine. Every deal came with a knife. Order was the only way to stay alive. La hesitated, the weight of his words pressing against her like gravity. This was the man she feared, the man who had built his empire out of ruin, but right now he looked like someone trying to hold himself together with the same precision he used on his business. She didn't know what made her do it, only that something inside her broke too, the wall between fear and pity crumbling. Slowly, without a word, she reached out and touched his hand. His skin was cold, trembling faintly under her fingers. The gesture was small, almost nothing, but in that sterile room of glass and light, it felt monumental. Kalen didn't pull away. He didn't look at her either. He just stood there, the tremor fading beneath her touch, his breath evening out. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't filled with tension. It was fragile, tender, uncertain. Lila's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't move. She didn't speak. There were no words for what passed between them. Something raw, dangerous, unspoken. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't surrender. It was recognition. When he finally lifted his gaze, their eyes met, and she saw it. The flicker of the man he might have been before power devoured him. And for that heartbeat of stillness, the empire around them disappeared. There was no blood, no order, no war, only two people standing in the aftermath of everything they had both destroyed, trying to remember what it meant to feel human. The silence after that night clung to them like smoke, heavy and unspoken. Lila barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those screens again, the docks, the blood, the faces that vanished beneath black water. But what stayed with her most wasn't the violence. It was Kalen's hand beneath hers, trembling like a man who'd forgotten how to breathe without control. Morning came through the penthouse windows in Manhattan, like a pale guillotine, washing over the marble floors and unfinished words between them. Kalen stood by the window, staring at the skyline as if it could offer answers. He looked different in daylight, less composed, almost haunted. Lila hovered near the threshold, unsure whether to speak or to let him drift into his silence. She'd learned that silence, in his world, wasn't peace. It was the space where thoughts sharpened into decisions. Finally, he said without turning, "They'll retaliate." His voice was low, measured, but underneath it was fatigue, something cracked. The docks were just a warning. They'll come for the heart next. She frowned, stepping closer. "And what's the heart, Kaelin?" He turned then, meeting her gaze with that quiet, lethal calm. "You." Her breath caught. She didn't know if it was a threat or a confession. He crossed the room in slow, deliberate steps, the way a storm gathers before breaking. "You were never supposed to matter," he said, almost to himself. "But you walked into my house, my life, and now every move I make bleeds into you." There was a bitterness in his tone that wasn't anger. It was fear disguised as control. Lila swallowed, her pulse skittering. "You don't own what you can't understand," she said softly. For a heartbeat, something like a smile ghosted across his lips. "No," he murmured, "but I can protect it." He moved past her then, the faint scent of his cologne and gun oil lingering in his wake. The way he said protect felt dangerous, as if his version of safety came wrapped in barbed wire. Hours later, Lila found herself in his private study, the one she hadn't seen before. A room full of maps, coded files, photographs pinned like constellations across the walls. Every red string was a connection, every mark a pulse in his empire. It wasn't chaos, it was obsession. She studied the pictures, the faces, the patterns, realizing that his control wasn't about greed. It was survival carved into structure. He'd built an entire world to keep himself from falling apart. Behind her, Kaelin entered quietly. "You shouldn't be in here," he said now, with menace, but resignation. She didn't turn. "You hide the world here," she said. "The truth, the things you can't look at in daylight." His jaw tightened. "The world doesn't reward people who look too long at truth. It punishes them." She faced him then, her voice trembling but firm. "Then maybe that's what you deserve." For a moment, they just stared at each other, the air between them charged, fragile, breaking. He closed the distance, stopping inches away, his breath warm against her skin. "You think I don't already know that?" he whispered. "You think I don't wake up every morning wondering when the punishment finally catches up?" His honesty hit her harder than any threat could. For the first time, she saw not the boss, not the monster, but a man cornered by his own power. Something in her chest twisted. She wanted to hate him, but instead she reached out, fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve. "You can stop it," she said, voice small, desperate. "You don't have to live like this." His eyes softened, then hardened again, the softness gone as fast as it came. "And what would you have me be, Lila? A man without teeth doesn't survive in this city." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "That's not surviving, Kaelin. That's rotting slower." He turned away sharply, his control snapping back like armor. "You don't understand my world." "Then let me," she whispered. He froze at that, shoulders tense. "Let you?" he repeated, his tone low, dangerous. "You think I could let anyone close enough to see how deep the cracks go?" But she didn't back away. She stepped closer until they were nearly touching, her voice trembling but steady. "You already have." Something broke in him then, a soundless exhale, a surrender he didn't mean to give. His eyes flickered down to her lips, and for one suspended second, time stopped. But he didn't move. He couldn't. He turned, his head, jaw tight, eyes closing as if fighting something invisible. "Don't," he whispered. "If I touch you, I won't stop." The words burned between them, both promise and warning. Lila's heart pounded, every nerve screaming for something she couldn't name. "Then maybe you shouldn't," she said softly. "Stop pretending you're made of steel when all you've ever wanted was to feel." The sound of his phone shattered the moment. He turned away sharply, answering it, his voice clipped and cold. "What is it?" A pause. His face hardened. "Send the location." He hung up, slipping back into command like a switch flipping. The warmth vanished. "Trouble?" she asked. He looked at her for a long beat. Always. Then he was gone, leaving her alone in that room of maps and ghosts, the hum of the city far below like a heartbeat echoing through glass. Lila stood there, trying to steady her breath, her mind spinning. She didn't know what scared her more, that she was falling for a man like him, or that somewhere, deep down, she believed he could still be saved. But when she looked at those red lines again, tracing power, betrayal, and blood, she realized something chilling. Every thread led back to one name, hers. The city of Las Vegas shimmered in a surreal haze, neon lights reflecting off glass towers while the desert beyond stretched endlessly, silent and indifferent. Kalen's private jet touched down on the tarmac, the engines cutting off like a heartbeat, leaving the city suddenly still. Lila followed him down the steps, her pulse racing, not from the thrill of the strip, not from the glitter and chaos, but from a sense that something was already wrong. The streets and casinos could dazzle, could blind, but she had learned to read danger in silence, in subtle shifts, in the way Kalen's jaw tensed or the way his eyes darted to the shadows. He moved with the calm precision of a predator, scanning, calculating, unflinching even as the desert wind bit through her lightweight coat. She stayed close, trying to match his rhythm, feeling the familiar knot of fear and fascination there. It always came with him. The legendary Babylonian tablet, the one that had pulled him to this city, was tucked safely in its protective case, but its presence only heightened the tension. Every artifact in Kalen's possession carried risk, but this one carried history, value, and blood. The meeting was supposed to be with a collector in a dimly lit suite atop a strip hotel, high enough that the city felt like it belonged to them alone. But the moment Kalen opened the briefcase to reveal the tablet, she sensed the shift, something wrong in the air, a thread she couldn't yet name. Her instincts screamed before anything happened, before the first gunshot shattered the silence. Chaos erupted as men in dark suits burst into the room, weapons raised, and the air filled with the acrid tang of gunfire and fear. Kalen's movements were lethal, fluid, a storm controlled by muscle memory and sharp instincts honed over years of power. He deflected attacks, neutralized threats, and all the while his eyes never left her, silent communication flashing between them. Lila's heart pounded, and then realization hit, a memory of the tablet's markings, the intricate cuneiform she had studied late at night, whispered clues and secrets in a language she could decode. The tablet wasn't just a prize, it was a warning, a message left by Silas himself. Her pulse raced faster as she pieced together the betrayal, the FBI, the rival dealer, the sudden ambush. It all connected in her mind, a web of deception spinning too close for comfort. With a burst of courage, she grabbed Kalen's hand and yanked him toward the only escape route she could see, a narrow service corridor leading to an abandoned dig site outside the city. Bullets ricocheted off walls, the sounds of struggle echoing like a drumbeat behind them. Dust swirled around their feet as they sprinted through the maze of tunnels. Her knowledge of ancient inscriptions guiding her steps, revealing hidden passages and concealed exits. Kalen's grip was firm, his presence grounding her even as adrenaline set her heart hammering against her ribs. Pounded, every nerve screaming for something she couldn't name. "Then maybe you shouldn't," she said softly. "Stop pretending you're made of steel when all you've ever wanted was to feel." The sound of his phone shattered the moment. He turned away sharply, answering it, his voice clipped and cold. "What is it?" A pause. His face hardened. "Send the location." He hung up, slipping back into command like a switch flipping. The warmth vanished. "Trouble?" she asked. He looked at her for a long beat. "Always." Then he was gone, leaving her alone in that room of maps and ghosts, the hum of the city far below like a heartbeat echoing through glass. Lila stood there, trying to steady her breath, her mind spinning. She didn't know what scared her more, that she was falling for a man like him, or that somewhere, deep down, she believed he could still be saved. But when she looked at those red lines again, tracing power, betrayal, and blood, she realized something chilling. Every thread led back to one name, hers. The city of Las Vegas shimmered in a surreal haze, neon lights reflecting off glass towers while the desert beyond stretched endlessly, silent and indifferent. Kalen's private jet touched down on the tarmac, the engines cutting off like a heartbeat, leaving the city suddenly still. Lila followed him down the steps, her pulse racing, not from the thrill of the strip, not from the glitter and chaos, but from a sense that something was already wrong. The streets and casinos could dazzle, could blind, but she had learned to read danger in silence, in subtle shifts, in the way Kalen's jaw tensed or the way his eyes darted to the shadows. He moved with the calm precision of a predator, scanning, calculating, unflinching even as the desert wind bit through her lightweight coat. She stayed close, trying to match his rhythm, feeling the familiar knot of fear and fascination there. It always came with him. The legendary Babylonian tablet, the one that had pulled him to this city, was tucked safely in its protective case, but its presence only heightened the tension. Every artifact in Kalen's possession carried risk, but this one carried history, value, and blood. The meeting was supposed to be with a collector in a dimly lit suite atop a strip hotel, high enough that the city felt like it belonged to them alone. But the moment Kalen opened the briefcase to reveal the tablet, she sensed the shift, something wrong in the air, a thread she couldn't yet name. Her instincts screamed before anything happened, before the first gunshot shattered the silence. Chaos erupted as men in dark suits burst into the room, weapons raised, and the air filled with the acrid tang of gunfire and fear. Kalen's movements were lethal, fluid, a storm controlled by muscle memory and sharp instincts honed over years of power. He deflected attacks, neutralized threats, and all the while his eyes never left her, silent communication flashing between them. Lila's heart pounded, and then realization hit, a memory of the tablet's markings, the intricate cuneiform she had studied late at night, whispered clues and secrets in a language she could decode. The tablet wasn't just a prize, it was a warning, a message left by Silas himself. Her pulse raced faster as she pieced together the betrayal, the FBI, the rival dealer, the sudden ambush. It all connected in her mind, a web of deception spinning too close for comfort. With a burst of courage, she grabbed Kalen's hand and yanked him toward the only escape route she could see, a narrow service corridor leading to an abandoned dig site outside the city. Bullets ricocheted off walls, the sounds of struggle echoing like a drumbeat behind them. Dust swirled around their feet as they sprinted through the maze of tunnels. Her knowledge of ancient inscriptions guiding her steps, revealing hidden passages and concealed exits. Kalen's grip was firm, his presence grounding her even as adrenaline set her heart hammering against her ribs. Every twist, every turn, every precarious ledge tested their strength, their trust, the fragile understanding that had grown between them over months of fear and proximity. Finally, they emerged into the dry Nevada night, the stars hanging over the desert like silent witnesses. Kalen leaned heavily against a jagged rock, his body trembling, blood streaking the side of his face from a graze that had gone unnoticed until now. Lila crouched beside him, her hands gentle, checking the wounds, her mind racing with both relief and lingering terror. For a long moment, the only sounds were the desert wind and their ragged breaths. Then he looked at her, eyes dark, stormy, and yet softened by exhaustion, and something more, something raw, vulnerable. His lips parted and the words came through gritted teeth, each syllable weighted with honesty he rarely allowed himself. "I never wanted to own you," he admitted, voice rough, raw, almost breaking. "I wanted to believe you couldn't leave." Lila's chest constricted at the confession, her fingers brushing his bloodied jaw without hesitation. The desert around them stretched endlessly, indifferent to the violence, the betrayal, or the fragile truth they shared. She had saved him tonight, not just with courage or skill, but with understanding, with insight into the history he valued and the mistakes he had ignored. And as he looked at her, each word heavy with the weight of his empire and his desire, she realized that control had never been the goal. Not for him, not for her, not really. What he craved was trust, presence, the confirmation that someone would stay when the rest of the world tried to run. She pressed her hand to his chest, feeling the rapid thrum of his heart beneath her palm, matching it with her own, and for a fleeting moment, the lines between fear, respect, and something dangerously close to love blurred. The betrayal of Silas had nearly cost them both, but it had also revealed what mattered most, what Kalen had hidden even from himself, and what Lila had discovered through fire, blood, and instinct, that even men built of steel could crave connection, and that even women bound by circumstance could become the catalyst for change. And there, under the cold sweep of Nevada stars, they sat together on the scorched earth, breathing, bleeding, alive, and for the first time, unguarded, knowing that the empire, the danger, and the desire were all irrevocably intertwined. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Kalen's penthouse, spilling across the polished floors and illuminating the artifacts that had once been his trophies, his possessions, and his armor. The city below moved with its usual relentless rhythm, oblivious to the fragile tension unfolding in the sky-high sanctum above it. Kalen sat in the high-backed chair behind his desk, the weight of the past days etched into the lines of his face, the dark bruises along his jaw, the subtle tremor of a hand that had never been used to weakness. Lila entered quietly, the faint scent of early morning coffee mixing with her own familiar determination, her eyes locking onto his with a clarity that cut through the lingering shadows of fear and distrust. She didn't need to speak at first. The silence carried years of unspoken truths, regrets, and challenges between them. Finally, she stepped closer, placing her hand lightly on the edge of the desk, her fingers brushing the restored Babylonian tablet she had carried across deserts and gunfire, now cracked but whole, a testament to endurance and care. "You can't have both, Kalen," she said softly, yet firmly, her voice slicing through the remnants of his control like sunlight through glass. "The Empire and me. You'll lose us both if you don't choose what kind of man you are." He looked at Ia. Then, meeting her gaze fully, and for the first time in months, she saw the mask slip entirely. There was no calculation, no dominance, only the raw exposure of a man who had built walls around his soul, walls that now showed cracks where fire and blood had tested their strength. His chest rose and fell with a slower rhythm, the kind that betrayed both exhaustion and revelation. "Then help me build something real," he said finally, voice husky, frayed at the edges, carrying the weight of a lifetime of power and isolation. Lila's heart caught, not with love, not yet, but with recognition of the magnitude of trust she was being offered, and the danger it carried. She placed her hand over his on the desk, letting their fingers meet above the tablet, an unspoken agreement bridging the chasm that had once yawned between fear and desire. The morning sun reflected off the glass and marble around them, painting gold streaks across their hands, across the cracked tablet, across the fragile space where the old empire had begun to dissolve. Lila exhaled slowly, feeling the tension bleed out of her body as Kalen mirrored the movement, both of them aware that this moment, this pact, was a turning point. She could almost hear the city breathe below them, a soft, constant pulse that seemed to echo the dangerous heartbeat they had shared through gunfire, betrayals, and nights spent in silent reflection of one another's strength. "We rebuild," she said, her voice low but resolute, carrying the authority of someone who had survived fire and refused to break. "Together," he answered, the word firm, deliberate, and yet carrying the weight of untested partnership. The skyline blazed gold behind them, a city of endless ambition and risk, reflecting the dawn of something that neither ownership nor fear could contain. Kalen's gaze lingered on her, the depth of his acknowledgement settling into the lines of his face, a recognition that she was no longer a bystander in his world, no longer a possession or a prize to be won. She was his equal, dangerous and brilliant, a force shaped by intelligence, courage, and unyielding will. And as their hands remained clasped, the tablet between them, Lila realized that they had created something neither of them could have anticipated, not love, not forgiveness, not safety, but a precarious, electrifying alliance forged from fire, defiance, and the raw recognition of each other's power. The penthouse was quiet except for the soft hum of the city, but within that silence, the air vibrated with potential, with challenges yet to come, with the unspoken promise that they would face whatever storms approach side by side. Kalen released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his eyes tracing the lines of the tablet, the desk, her hand, and then the city beyond. Lila stayed still, letting him take in the fragile peace that had been won through violence, cunning, and courage, understanding that this equilibrium was delicate and earned, not given. She had seen him at his most ruthless, and he had seen her at her most fearless, and in that exchange a rare equality had been forged. He leaned back slightly, letting the weight of the empire and his own heart settle, and in the slow light of dawn, they both knew that nothing would ever be the same. The collector's wife had transformed. She was no longer simply the observer, the captive, or the wife. She was a partner, a strategist, a force that Kalen could not dominate, and perhaps, secretly, did not want to. The golden skyline reflected in her eyes as she pulled her hand away from his just long enough to nod. A silent acknowledgement of what had been built, what could be rebuilt, and what could survive. Kalen's hand lingered near hers, and for a moment the two of them existed in a space where power, trust, and danger intertwined so completely that even the ghosts of the past seemed to bow before them. The morning deepened, the city moving toward its inevitable chaos, but in that penthouse, with the tablet restored, their hands clasped, and the skyline burning gold, a new empire quietly began, not one ruled by fear or ownership, but by understanding, partnership, and the promise of shared ambition. The air between them hummed with unspoken challenges, the kind that could either destroy them or create something extraordinary. Lila's eyes met his, unwavering, and Kalen's gaze returned with equal force. No words were needed beyond the silent acknowledgement of what had been earned, what had been survived, and what could now be built together. The pact was made, fragile yet unbreakable, a bond of fire, defiance, and the kind of dangerous respect that could outlast empires. And as the city woke below them, Lila realized with quiet triumph that she was no longer merely the collector's wife. She had become something far rarer, Kalen Marcus's equal, his partner, and the one who could hold the line between chaos and order, between past and future, between fear and freedom. The dawn stretched into gold, painting every artifact, every polished surface, and every calculated corner of the penthouse with light, reflecting not just the city outside, but the new beginning they had forged together.